it's been, for me, a real joy to spend the last couple of years in between making a living and doing the things that I have to do, immersing myself in Dante's Divine Comedy. And the reason, well, firstly, because this stuff is so wonderful and so intricate and such a mind bender, but also from an astrological point of view, there's so much in there. And there's so much that would in there that would be useful to modern astrologers. So what I'm going to do today is work with the first part of what I've written. There are two parts, part one and part two. Part one is entitled A Redemptive Universe. Part two deals with questions of astrology, divination, magic, and nature. But I'm going to mostly focus on part one because it's a very good way for people not familiar with Dante to become familiar with him. And hopefully, if you haven't worked with Dante at all, this will inspire you to at least pick up a paperback and peruse a little bit. What I'm going to start, though, since this is most likely an astrologically sophisticated crowd, is a birth chart for Dante. And it's always a good way to introduce him to fellow astrologers. I had a few restrictions in coming up with a birth chart. We do not have a set-in-stone birth time. We know from Boccaccio that Dante had said that he was born in late May 1265. Everyone knows he has Sun in Gemini. He makes a very big deal about it in the Divine Comedy. He also wrote a poem in 1295, which some scholars have reported actually gives the inverse of his astrological chart. It describes winter. It describes winter at sunset. And I found their arguments so compelling that it would make sense to me that Dante would have a Gemini ascendant as well as a Gemini sun. Also, in Paradise, he speaks with one of his ancestors who gives his date of birth in terms of the revolutions, or how many times the planet Mars has touched upon the lion. 580 times, he says. And it's interesting that in the last few days of 1265, indeed, Mars had gone into Leo. I don't have access to the almanacs that he used, but the verse gives a pretty good indication that Dante also, like his ancestor, felt he had Mars in Leo. So I have enough to go on to do a little rectification. Also, one of the people he speaks with in hell is a former teacher and mentor of his named Brunetto Latini. And Latini talks about his fortunate birth, and his fortunate stars, I should say, if he had discerned right. And so I had to come up with a chart that Brunetto Latini would have felt would be adequate for Dante to account for his fame. And so I came up with this. May 28th, 1265, 4:40 a.m., Florence, Italy. And what impressed me are a few things. First of all, there's a lot of orientality, planets rising in the sky before he was born, in the morning before he was born. He was born, of course, right at the sunrise, according to this chart. And we have Mercury, which is going out of combustion, Saturn going out of combustion, and a very interesting Jupiter. This could account for him being fairly talented and becoming well known. However, he had secret enemies, and his his secret enemy that did him in and forced him into exile in 1301 was the then Pope Boniface VIII. Boniface is represented in his chart by Jupiter in Taurus in, of course, the 12th house, the house of one's secret enemies. And it's no accident that both Jupiter and Saturn are together in the 12th house. Dante also has Moon in Scorpio, which befits his very intense nature, we could call it. Not your typical Gemini. We would see a very strong square from Moon to Neptune. What Dante or Brunetto Lutini may have seen instead, however, is an applying square from Moon to Venus. Venus in the Moon sign and a trine is actually fairly favorable in terms of romantic love. And those of you who know a little bit of Dante know that the love of his life was named Beatrice, who died when he was a young man and who he puts in heaven as his guide to the afterlife. So I think that's about what I want to say about the chart, although this might be a good place for any kind of questions or discussions. I'm curious if anyone has some input on this.
A question about the house system.
Okay. Everyone asks me about house system, even when I use a quadrant system. I think I am cursed for life with this. It's not clear. Guido Bonatti would have used Al-Capitia's house system. Guido Bonatti, who some of you will know we will find in hell, although Dante says nothing about Bonatti. Bonatti was the astrologer for the other side of the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict. He was a Ghibelline and a counselor to the Ghibellines, and Dante was a Guelph. However, Bonatti's work was a major source for Dante on his astronomy and astrology. So I'm going with Al-Capitius. I'm curious whether there's even a minority use of whole sign houses, because that'd be very interesting in terms of this particular chart. And the Mercury and Venus and Saturn in the 12th. Okay.
Okay, another question.
Anyone else?
Planets in combustion. Not sure what that means.
Okay. Actually, it's a really simple concept. If a planet is within 8 degrees of the sun, that is considered burned up by the sun. The later medieval tradition, particularly Lilly, thought of that as a terrible thing. What's interesting about this chart is that Mercury is moving out of combustion. It's actually moving toward visibility. And it's moving toward not the sun, but a conjunction with Saturn. So combustion is interesting. I don't use it as much with Mercury as I would with other planets, because Mercury of its own nature is so often within the sun's rays. So that's a quick thing on combustion.
You've got it also an agreement that that he probably would have used in Al-Capitius, and that
okay.
Chaucer also used Al-Capitius.
Not surprising. Between Dante and Chaucer, there were about 50 years. And interestingly, by the time we get to Chaucer, astrology is far more mainstream than it was in Dante's age, where it was still more controversial. Okay.
Okay. Oh, there's one question about Dante's real-life enemies. Do we actually know entirely about his real-life enemies?
By real-life enemies, what do you mean?
Well, I suspect that this is in reference when you were talking about the secret enemies.
Ah, okay. Here, well, Dante was one of those. He was a politician as well as a poet, and he was one of those people who, as a politician, was very gifted, very eloquent, and probably very arrogant and obnoxious. And he was part of a faction in Florence called the White Guelphs. Their enemies were the Black Guelphs. The Ghibellines had been exiled when Dante was born, basically. What happened was that the Pope really wanted to make an alliance with Florence. Dante refused. He got into a fight with the Pope. What happened was that, unbeknownst to Dante, the Pope and the Black Guelphs made a deal with a French nobleman, and the French nobleman took over Florence, invited the Black Guelphs in there. Dante at the time was in Rome trying to make peace with the Pope, and he never came home again after that happened. That was in 1301, and that event actually forms a biographical background of the Divine Comedy. And so he had his overt enemies, and it's hard not to notice Pluto in the 7th. However, it was also governed by Jupiter, which is clearly a 12th house planet. And so he has been, and I think he judged himself, and I think history has agreed with him. He was pretty poorly treated, even in terms of, even on the scale of Italian politics circa 1300.
Carol has a comment. He placed his enemies in hell, didn't he?
He also put his enemies in purgatory and even in heaven. He tried to, as best he could, he tried to be fair-minded. I think there's a he has a reputation for putting enemies in hell. I think he does, and there are exceptions. It is not completely sour grapes he is doing in the Inferno.
Well, that looks like it's ready for you to go on again.
Okay, so let's go to hell. Okay, just to give you a sense of what's to come. I have some schema of hell, and notice how hell looks. This is from the Mandelbaum translation. Hell looks, like, first of all, it goes down. It goes from the wide to the narrow. It's also, its construction is sort of loose. There's something artistically very ugly about this particular diagram, especially when you compare it to Purgatory. This, I think, is the Derling-Martinez version. Maybe Mark Musa, I don't know. And this is much more orderly, but you can see toward the bottom that things are pretty disorderly. We'll get to that. And Paradise. We'll give it to you in color. In Italian, with the levels of the different planets, the fixed stars, the beatific rose at the top, and Dio at the very top. So just the quickest of quick summaries is that Dante is going through your basic midlife crisis at the age of 35. He has lost his way. Heaven feels so sorry for the guy and so alarmed at what he is doing to himself that they send Virgil from limbo to guide him through hell and purgatory, to be taken over by his former girlfriend, at least in fantasy, of Beatrice to take him through heaven. And what we have is, in 100 cantos, a sort of ceremonial or symbolic rendition of an entire spiritual path. Where the planets come in is fascinating. As you could tell, he only mentions planets outright in heaven. You have the sphere of the moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. You have, in Paradise, you have planets in sort of as a spiritual potential. In Purgatory, there's an alignment between the 7 cardinal or so-called deadly sins and the 7 planets. And those are planets that are rendered in a more psychological frame. And here in hell, which is what you're looking at now, we have, we will also find planets are structuring its organization in a hidden way, because you can only talk about planets in heaven, quite literally. However, the planets that are used by Dante are used in hell for their elemental qualities, even their weather qualities. So we have this hierarchy. Hell is the most sensual, the most earthly, the most earthly in sort of a degraded sense. And here we have planets as elements. In Purgatory, which is much more human, which is much more about making progress, we have planets in more of a psychological mode, and in Paradise, of course, we have them in more of a spiritual or exalted mode. So the purpose of the trip through hell, and I'm aware that most people who have read Dante have stopped with the Inferno and really liked it. The purpose of hell is for him to understand himself. And when we think of ourselves beginning a spiritual journey, it's easy, but we can easily be mistaken, a sidetrack, that's what I was trying to say, by relying on inspiration alone. There's a need for us to get to know who we are at a very fundamental level. And Dante does this through hell. It's not that he learns great things, but the activity of Dante in the Inferno is to almost participate with the people he sees. It's very interesting how he would do that. Now, and just to go through this obviously is a negative hierarchy. Think of Jerusalem at the top, and then we have these various sections of hell. And the numbers here represent the different circles. And you'll see that number 8 has like 9 circles all of its own. So we pass limbo, which is where these so-called virtuous pagans live. If you're familiar with the novel by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called The First Circle, it's a POW or a prison camp in Russia where all the elite go. It's sort of the best of a bad deal. Then we have circles for the lustful and the gluttonous. And what's interesting is what planets are in charge of the lustful and gluttonous. These are human failings. People in hell have sort of made more of a lifestyle of this. They've gotten stuck there. lustful obviously is Venus. For planet, I'd like to ask a question of people. Anyone take a guess who the glutton, what planet gluttony is allied with? We'll be getting back to this later in Purgatory. Is there a place for somebody to say, to raise their hand? And
Well, in the question box, we have a couple of people saying Jupiter.
yes, absolutely. Jupiter is the big fat planet. Jupiter is also about abundance and superabundance, and things can be too much. And it's no accident that the two benefics are the topmost in hell. Venus and Jupiter being the two benefics, Jupiter being the greater benefic. Now, I couldn't quite go beyond this for a while, and I had a sort of flash of insight and realized that the situation amongst the lustful and the situations amongst the gluttonous have to do with weather. That people may know the lustful are billowed about in this torrential windstorm, so they're sort of flying all over the place, which, you know, on a psychological view is sort of what lust can do to us. But it also is a parody or an inversion of what Venus gives when it is a planet signifying weather. Venus has to do with the gentle winds, with the nice breezes. We will later find gentle winds and nice breezes way up in the earthly paradise. But now it is a wind gone wild, which is sort of what lust does. Gluttony, Jupiter as a planet of abundance and also a planet of fertility, is associated with more with rain. And here, the punishment for these people, it's not so painful. I wouldn't particularly want to be in it all the time, though. They're sort of being poured upon by this sort of dark, sort of muggy, fetid, smelly kind of rain. So what you have here is, again, an inversion of the power of abundance of the great benefic.
And so here's an interesting comment. Waterboarded. Waterboarded. There's a certain symmetry there.
I'm going to have to think about that one. There's nothing particularly about breathing in hell, interestingly enough. Although, as you get further down, there's not going to be much room for it. Let's go down a little bit further. And here we're going to encounter the three more neutral planets. Mercury has more to do with avarice. And here is the avaricious and the prodigal. And by the way, this is where there's a wonderful digression on Lady Fortune. And astrologers who use the Lot of Fortune would probably really enjoy reading that. But the avaricious and the prodigal are sort of, they're in two teams playing this really wretched game of rolling boulders toward each other. And the idea being that they are just the inverse of the same thing, which is an overvaluation of money and property. And I couldn't get very far with the mercurial in terms of the situation there. Although Mercury does have a sort of binary nature as a morning and an evening star. But it feels a little loose at this point. Now, interestingly, what we get and the fifth circle is a swamp. The swamp of the river Styx. We get swamp and mud. And the wrathful are basically wallowing in mud and hurling at each other and doing bad things to each other, because that's what wrathful people do. Sullen are kind of like bubbling, their words sort of bubble up from the mud. And to me, there's something lunar about it, because first of all, elementally, the moon is wet, and here we have like enough moisture. Even for this afternoon in Rhode Island, we just have this major thunderstorm. But also, once again, the moisture is not life-giving. It's sort of like gross. Also, we all have moods. We have moods of being irritable. We have moods of being depressed or worried. They come and go. The moon is a planet of change. So that the difficulty with both of these groups are they get stuck in one mode. That people who are wrathful by nature need to develop their reflective side. People who are sullen need to, get worked up. So I think there's an interesting symmetry there. Now, from there we go into the city of Dis, and this is where evil, as it were, is less accidental, it's more malevolent, people are more distant. And inside the wall, are what are called the heretics. These are people who we would probably call nihilists from a spiritual point of view. And interestingly enough, the themes of this particular area, and this is in Canto 10 of the Inferno, one of the best known cantos in the entire poem. It's a very solar kind of place. The character, especially the Farinata, who holds hell in all disdain, is basically a solar kind of individual. Unfortunately for them, they are not within the sight of the sun. They're stuck in these fiery graves because they didn't think anything happened to them after they died. Well, they had a sort of rude awakening, I guess. Now, from the heretics, that in some ways is somewhat of an add-on, we go toward the violent. But let me pause for a moment and see if there's any questions or discussion that anyone has.
Well, there is one comment about the idea of Mercury as the trickster, the trickster aspect of Mercury seems to fit.
Yeah, except these people, they don't come across as too bright. An interesting feature that Dante uses for people consumed by money in hell is they have no identities. That who they were was so submerged into their desire for monetary gain that they became almost automatons. We find more of the trickster quality of Mercury with the avaricious actually in Purgatory, which we'll get to in just a little bit. So that's a very relevant comment. It's relevant more in Purgatory than in hell, it seems.
Did Dante use like combinations, do you think, in any like the wrathful and sullen almost sounds like a Mars-Saturn conjunction?
I'm thinking. Well, in a sense, he needs to save Mars and Saturn for what lies below. or I should say what lies beneath, because these are the two malevolents. He's going to get maximum use out of them. When you get to these upper regions of hell, you're in a place that is, I could hardly call it pleasanter, but there's less of a sense of evil that's going on, more of a sense of being misguided or out of proportion.
Here's a comment. Each was excessive in their sin, so their punishment is developing the opposite trait.
How so? The opposite trait? Oh, you mean, oh, I see. Yes, of course. And this is what we would do on a lunar level in our daily lives. You know, we go through, you know, we're sort of worried about something, then we realize that we're angry, and then we sort of deal with the feeling angry or irritated, then we feel sad. I mean, it's a normal thing that we do, whereas these people were stuck. And the feature of all the people in hell is they're somehow, to some extent, stuck within their own ego, we could call it.
There's another question on,
yes,
was there a planet for limbo?
Not that, I don't think so. You could look at it as sort of a weakened Jupiter. In my manuscript, I say limbo is like being at a sort of nice hotel with interesting people, but nobody has anything to say.
It's a good description.
And it's interesting because, you know, in Canto 4, Dante and Virgil go, you know, talk to all these, are with all these poets and heroes of antiquity, and there's no conversation that's worth recording. Okay.
Here's one more comment for Mercury. For the Mercury, could throwing boulders be very coarse, self-serving, and hurtful communication?
This is more like rolling boulders. Think of workmen in ancient times having to, like, you know, maybe Egyptian slaves having to, like, roll this thing. I'm not sure communication is particularly an issue for this, but I will, I need to ponder this fourth circle a little bit more. Okay, let's go to where it's fun, except if you live there. Circle 7 has 3 parts, and obviously, if you're going to talk about the, quote, the violent, you're going to talk about Mars. And what is wonderful from an aesthetic point of view is how much Mars he squeezes into the different environments that he depicts. That the uppermost circle of the, quote, violent are, well, put it this way, there's a river that runs through this part of hell called Phlegethon, which is similar to the word for blood. It's obviously a blood-red river. So we're already starting with Mars imagery. The violent are up to their shoulders or their waists or their knees in this particular sort of hot, bloody river. And if they try to get out, there are centaurs there with arrows and other means to keep them there. So we have sort of the violent soldiers in this particular area. Interestingly enough, the one of the chief centaurs that Dante talks with is Chiron. So, people might find that interesting. So from there, we have, it's a little hard to read, I'm afraid, going down the river, past where the bloodthirsty were, are those who kill themselves. And Canto 13 has this wonderful beginning where it talks about these gnarled branches on this like parched, lifeless ground. And the trees, the sort of gnarled bushes there, are actually the bodies of those who had committed suicide. They can only talk if you break off a branch. And it's interesting how much the elemental quality of Mars as a dry, sort of death-wielding planet comes here. That you do have plants and life, but they're hardly plants and life. They have been almost eliminated of liveliness because of the hot, dry nature of Mars. Then when you go further, I need to move more quickly here. You have now a parched desert plain where there is a steady rain of fire, and its inhabitants are like running around in this like very hot area, needing and trying to avoid the flames. And here is where, these are the quote, sodomites, unquote, where Dante meets his former mentor, Brunetto Latini, who probably did his astrological chart. So I could go on about Mars, but we have multiple instances of Mars imagery. And for violent, it doesn't mean simply acts of violence, but it also means ways in which we do violence to ourselves. And the environments are hot, dry, parched, fiery, red. It's quite a tour de force when you actually look for Mars kinds of things. Okay, that brings us to the greater malefic Saturn. And it's interesting that almost half of hell is governed by Saturn. And elementally, Saturn is cold and dry. It has the quality that Earth has of confining, blocking, restricting, constricting. It also, more traditionally than in modern times, Saturn has to do with corruption and decay. And this is going to be the area for the what are called the fraudulent. And it's a little hard to read. Here it says ordinary fraud, and at the bottom is treacherous fraud, which is actually a pretty accurate way of depicting it. There are 9 levels of, quote, ordinary fraud. And here are people who just rip people off, not personally, very intentionally, but if you were in their way, they would take advantage of you. And again, there was nothing personally. So we have the quote, panderers and seducers are what we would call the sex traffickers. The flatterers are, as you would imagine, they're swimming in shit. The simonists are these are people who trafficked in church offices. Canto 20, which I spent all of Part 2 on, the diviners, astrologers, and magicians. If you don't know what they do, they walk around in this circle, sort of in a very sad parade, with their heads twisted backwards, so that you're not quite sure if they're going ahead or behind. Barrators are basically sleazy politicians. Hypocrites, we know that. Thieves, fraudulent counselors, we find Ulysses there. Sowers of scandal and schism, falsifiers. What happens is the punishments for these people, they become more immobile, more trapped in something. I mentioned the flatterers are sort of in this puddle of feces. The diviners, astrologers are kind of, they're sort of walking around slowly because they're sort of walking backwards. The barrators are in this river of pitch with devils sort of at them. Hypocrites walk around with leaden ecclesiastical garb. Thieves exchange their bodies with serpents who kind of surround them and engulf them. Fraudulent counselors are encased in flames. Sowers of scandal and discord are mutilated. Falsifiers are often, most people here have been completely immobilized through illness. And so what we have in different ways are the good things of the world, the good things of life, completely turned around and made poisonous. And there's late in some of the later cantos here, there's a quality of things. They even use a number reckoning to show how things are getting more and more narrow and small as you go down. Think of hell as this sort of huge intestinal tract. And the bottom, as you can see, by the way, if you haven't been familiar with this before, hell is not just hot. And in the bottommost, it is ice cold. And of course, ice in some ways is the most saturnine manifestation, both physically and emotionally. And here are people who have turned to ice in a lot of different ways. And some higher up, they can at least talk to you. Lower down, they're simply immobilized, encased in ice. It doesn't get more saturnine than this. And Lucifer is up to his waist in ice as well, with 3 heads chewing a famous traitor. Okay. Whoops, I'm almost halfway through this, and I haven't gotten to Purgatory. Okay. Let me stop here for a moment, see what questions or comments people have.
Nothing it looks like at the moment.
No. The malefics have just subdued everybody. Okay. Well, happily, this is actually pretty straightforward stuff. And it's some of the world's best, most interesting, and provocative literature. However, it gets better. Here's time for a quiz. Who out there in webinar land knows the first stellar body that Dante and Virgil see as when they climb out of hell? I hear a typing. Somebody knows it. This is Jeopardy.
Huh?
Everyone knows that they
The
just think somebody
the
else should
moon.
answer. No, not the moon. The moon is considered a counterfeit sun.
Venus?
She's in Pisces, heralding the arrival of the sun in Aries. It is how Purgatory opens, and it's one of the most moving passages in the poem. And Venus is also, there's also a lot of religious symbolism there, but there's something, this is the pre-dawn sky where the sun hasn't risen but the planets before the sun have, and there's Venus. It's just lovely. However, there's a lot of work to do here, because here is where you reclaim your nature that the world had twisted, and you become complete again. And that completion actually doesn't take place until you're up at the top in the so-called earthly paradise. Many people consider Purgatorio their favorite of the three. It is the most psychological. It is the most, its people are the most like we, like us. There's also a blending of suffering and hope that is much more like our planet and our own lives. In hell, there's plenty of suffering. It has no point. In purgatory, there's plenty of suffering, but it has a great point. So, interestingly, the first part is in this section below these ledges, and you can see by the depiction here how rugged the landscape is, how difficult the climb is. And we're still at a very elemental sense of reality here. We haven't gone up at all. And there's a need to put a lot of exertion into it. However, most of the people they meet are really kind of lazy. In life, they have put off waking up spiritually, and in death, they're made to sort of hang out here until they have been there the appropriate amount of time. By the way, the deadly sin we'll get to, which is Saturn, is laziness. We'll see that it's the center of purgatory. And we actually start with spiritual laziness. And by laziness, I also mean involvement in other activities. In Buddhism, there are three kinds of laziness. That's actually very relevant to this. There's sloth, which is sort of, I'd rather watch television. There is being distracted by worldly activities, and there's losing heart. What we have here is a lot of people have been distracted by worldly activities, so they have to wait till they get to purgatory. And what happens here is I'm going to kind of point to the various terraces and associate the planets. And you're going to see a really interesting sequence. Pride is sun. And notice how you have the largest area here for the proud. That becomes sort of the base failing of all of us. Second in line, but not by much, is the envious. Anyone know what planet may be associated with envy? Somebody's typing.
Actually, my cat.
Your cat is typing. You have a very clever cat.
Mercury? Pluto
No.
or Moon?
Moon is the answer. So we're going to talk about the two luminaries first when we go through these one by one. Wrathful is Mars. Slothful, as I said a few minutes ago, is Saturn. Here we go. Avaricious and prodigal, Mercury. Gluttonous, Jupiter. And lustful, see the fires up there? That's to quench the and to express lust, is Venus. So we start with the luminaries. We have we have the malefics, followed by the neutral Mercury, and on top are the benefics. So pride, these are people who, until they are ready to ascend, are walking around carrying these huge boulders on their backs so that their bodies are continually bent down toward the ground. And there's a wealth of wonderful symbolism here I won't get into, but you can feel that, pride being a burden. Also, these are people who cannot look up because of the burdens they're carrying. And we're going to find, this is Canto 10 through 12 of Purgatorio, we're going to find that these are people who took great pride, sometimes in their family, sometimes in their political stature, but mostly we talk to people proud of their own accomplishments and achievements. That we hear a lot about people who are excellent in their professions, including poets. And and there's sort of a teaching here that the things that we do that we are most proud of, we can become trapped by. They can actually limit us because of the stuff that we bring along with that. Now, the envious. These people can't see either. The reason is their eyes are closed shut with wires, and they sort of have beggar's garb, and they're kind of leaning next to each other like blind beggars. And interestingly, the word used for envious is the word invidia, which means not seeing. So like the proud, the envious cannot see either. And so what's the connection between the moon and envy? Well, there's sort of a visual one. The idea being that the moon shines with a borrowed light and is never as bright as the sun, so it's continually wanting to be brighter than it is. But I think it actually goes deeper than that. The moon is a planet of adaptability, and it is not a planet of combat. It's not a planet of achievement. It makes do. So when we're given a challenge, or we meet people who seem to have it good, better than we have it, instead of using that as inspiration to try to do better ourselves, what happens is we resent them. We wish them harm. The idea of envy or invidia here, it's similar to Schadenfreude, which is delight in the suffering of others. particularly Hollywood celebrities who, you know, can't stay away from alcohol and cocaine, and various other people like that. You know, we actually take some kind of delight in watching the privileged ones not do very well, and that would be considered a form of envy. Anyone have anything to say about the proud or the envious? I don't want to hear anyone's confession.
No, I don't see anything in the question one, so go for it.
I will move on. I'll move to, as we call it in Eastern Massachusetts, Mars. Here again are people who can't see. The wrathful are encased in this thick black smoke. It's interesting, though, that they talk with one person, Dante and Virgil do, and that one person has a lot of things to say that are, there's an edge. There's sort of he's a very irritable kind of guy, but he actually talks about a lot of important things. And I think the symbolism there is that when used correctly, there's a tremendous amount of intelligence in our irritation or anger, even our resentment. But it is so easy to become blinded by it that its sheer emotional arousal undercuts the intelligence of the maybe what it started in the first place. So that's Mars, and it's followed by Saturn. And the slothful, however, who Dante and Virgil only see at night, they have to make up for lost time. They can't be like the sluggards down and below among the, quote, late repentant. But instead, they're running. And they hardly have time to talk to Dante and Virgil because they continue to run. And they shout out slogans, almost like a Marine boot camp. It's very odd, but you know, what does it take for us to combat our tendency toward laziness is we arouse ourselves. We have to exert ourselves. We can tell ourselves lots of things, but sometimes we just have to get moving.
There is an observation or a question.
Yes.
And actually this would relate, I think, and that is it just the planets, or would it also be the signs they rule? So like for the sun and moon, Leo and Cancer. And extending that then would, you know, like the wrathful, would it be both signs ruled by Mars if there's a relationship?
Okay. I tend not to see it that way for two reasons in Dante. I mean, I might, believe me, as an astrologer, I'll have no trouble with that. But he doesn't use, he uses the signs up till he gets to his own sign, Gemini, as a, they're more or less place markers for the sky. You don't get as much of their sort of nature. We get a little more in Paradise, though. Secondly, all of us have all the planets, whereas all of us don't have all the signs. If we have a sun, we are vulnerable to pride. If we have a Mars, we're vulnerable to wrath. So I think the planets are universal, and the steps of purgatory are meant to be universal as well. So that would be my answer. Anyone else before we get to the avaricious?
That looks like it for now.
Okay. Quickly, because I don't want to spend too little time in Paradise. The avaricious and prodigal, it's interesting, Dante talks to a king and a pope. Their punishment is they're sort of on the ground, basically looking at dirt, even though the sun is blazing over their heads. Greed, focus on money, as was said before, is a diminishing of our potential and a diminishing of the abundance of the universe that is free. And these are interesting cantos amongst the avaricious. He talks to the founder of the French dynasty, and Dante really doesn't like the French. It's actually almost hilarious. The gluttonous have this gorgeous tree in front of them, trees actually, there are a couple of them, that have fruit on the branches, and they emit a fragrant odor. So we have a real sense of the abundance of nature, except they can never reach up to the fruit. The fruit is always sort of going away from them. It's sort of like Tantalus in ancient mythology. And these individuals, the more what the trees do to them is they make them not nourished but wasting away. So you have an area that looks like a concentration camp, even though the people are fairly cheerful there. You can imagine such a thing. And that would be the benefic Jupiter. And up at the top, the lustful, with the fires of lust and this sense of purgation. Now, all this, the idea is that people could actually spend decades, hundreds of years on any particular ledge. So this is a long-term reclamation project, like most of us feel about our lives. It's no accident that Thomas Merton called his spiritual biography The Seven-Story Mountain, as a evocation of the struggle but the hopefulness that's in purgatory. However, you pass through the wall of fire and you climb up a little bit more and you are at the earthly paradise that represents our original purified condition as human beings. And it's there that, as most of you probably know, Virgil disappears and Beatrice is there, and they have a very memorable encounter where she berates him for having become such a spiritual slacker. But he confesses, he crosses the river of forgetfulness, and they eventually launch into paradise. Whoop, wrong way. Anybody in this group familiar with the Paradisa, or want to share anything about it if you are?
Well, I know one person is. Carol Tebbs is here.
Hi, Carol. Well,
go for it.
Let me just say, it's not easy going. It's fairly difficult. It is an acquired taste. Once you acquire the taste, it is compelling, rich, completely wonderful, and with some of the best poetry imaginable. because this is their journey through paradise. Now, in terms of the narrative, the journey has two functions. First of all, Dante, having been purified of sin in a symbolic way, is now being recruited to become allied with God's providence. So there's a sense of sort of fashioning a warrior out of this guy. The second one is we are going into rarefied levels of human experience toward direct contemplation of divinity. And as we go up, the environment becomes more rarefied, more non-conceptual, more ultimate, we'll say. However, they start in the moon. And it's interesting that the planets, all the people in paradise are saved. They all are in heaven. Yet, even in heaven, there's a bit of a hierarchy. People can only have so much beatitude, and we have different capacities. And so, the sphere of the moon are for people who broke their vows, particularly their monastic vows. Why did they break their vows? Because they were forced to. There are two people mentioned, both of whom had to leave their respective convents because they were married to other people for political reasons. Now you might say, well, what's the problem with that? Beatrice says later, well, they could have chosen to, become martyrs instead. It's interesting, the people in the first few levels of paradise suffer from what I call the limitation of reasonability. I said earlier with envy that moon adapts. Moon is changeable. It flows with what is. And these people adapted. Maybe they adapted too well. And in some sense, the natural antidote for moon is Mars. These people could have put up a fight. We also see in the sphere of the moon, because the moon is the closest to the earth, that it is the most physical. We see people's faces. We have more of a sense of an environment. Then we go to Mercury. Now it's interesting, we've previously been talking about Mercury in terms of avarice, but here what we have are leaders who, aside from the good things they may have done, we're also interested in improving their reputation and sort of positive notoriety. So they were mostly good people, but there were some limitations. And here we see more of Mercury as, we tend to call it the trickster, but sort of a conniver. Trying to, get a little edge out there for themselves. Interestingly enough, in the sphere of the moon, the people are very white and pale, and it's very sort of quiet. In Mercury, the saved souls are sort of darting around like little fish. And there's a sort of a joyful, happy, almost childlike quality that we encounter there. Venus obviously will be people who Dante in Canto 9 mentions people who were sort of great lovers in their youth but repented later. However, Venus isn't just about love, lust, and sexuality. It's also about nice things. It's about the good things in life. It's about pleasure. And in the preceding Canto 8, Dante talks with a former friend of his who was a European prince named Charles Martel, who, and the commentators aren't quite sure why he's at Venus, because there's no particular record of amorous adventures or anything like that. In fact, Dante makes sort of a big deal of praising his wife. And my interpretation, along with that of some others, is that here was a guy who really liked the elegance and the refinement of courtly life. And it's not that he wasn't a really good person. He certainly was. And he did, and certainly worthy of salvation in Dante's eyes, at least. But not a, but there was that kind of love of luxury that could be distracting. I'll cover the sun, and then we'll see if other people have questions or comments. The imagery of the sphere of the sun is striking. It is very bright. It's very solar. The people there are the people who had some shade of, some manner of wisdom and contributed toward being sort of church leaders in some kind of profound way. What's interesting, though, is it evokes the equator and ecliptic as the paths of the sun. It evokes the orderliness of creation. Also, it talks about clocks, and which really hadn't existed up to that until very recently. And the sun is also, there's also a evocation of sundials with the sun. As is, there's this wonderful scene where Beatrice is eclipsed by the sun, and the word eclipse is used. So we're getting a lot of very strong astronomical imagery, but the environment is just dazzlingly bright. And within that environment are first one, then a second, then toward the end a third concentric circle of 12 stars. And people think of the 12, by the way, in terms of the zodiac. And we can think of these people as stars like we use the words, you know, like Hollywood stars or something like that. Okay. We're going to go to a blazing ending here, but I want to see if anyone has any thoughts or comments or questions.
There's a question that, or
Yes.
a comment. This is
Yes.
very Kabbalistic, something like
Oh.
Adam Kadmon.
Okay. I wouldn't be surprised. The medieval Kabbalah was, I'll put it this way, Dante lived in an area in which there was a lot of trade and a large merchant class, and there was a lot of movement of ideas from area to area, including from Spain. And so one thing that modern scholars are beginning to appreciate more is the Arabic sources for Dante. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was also some Jewish Kabbalistic sources as well. I can't say much about the reference, but it wouldn't surprise me. Also, there is here, as with the Kabbalah, a Neoplatonic influence. He's not making this stuff up in terms of the spheres of the planets. He's doing some interesting things in terms of the narrative here. But he has a lot to work with. Okay.
There's
Anyone
another,
else?
yeah, so is Beatrice a representation of the moon?
Beatrice is a representation of the sun, much more than the moon. There's some imagery on the earthly paradise that very strongly puts her as a solar person. By this I mean the correlation of the sun with what they would call wisdom, what we might call consciousness. Some people have said that Beatrice is like revelation as opposed to Virgil being reason. I think we shouldn't allegorize this too much because there's a definite human being that Dante is portraying. She is his guide through paradise, and so she is the chief theologian of the expedition. And she's also, because of his earthly love for her, that finds resonance with the whole concept of God's love in the universe, made very personal. There's much to say about Beatrice, and that wasn't much, but there's much more to say.
There's another comment here about, just a comment of why Virgil cannot continue as the guide through heaven, since he lived before Christ and could not have been baptized as a Christian.
Amongst the sphere of Jupiter, there is a person who fought in the Trojan War, which is a really interesting trick because the Trojan War was about a millennium before Christ. Dante makes Virgil a spokesperson for the entire classical tradition that Dante inherited. Also, he has a lot of personal identification with Virgil, and particularly with Virgil's epic hero Aeneas, who also takes a trip through the afterlife. Virgil represents a point of view that is rational, reasonable, and limited. Beatrice represents a point of view that is super rational, supernatural, and unlimited. And as we make progress, we go from, let's say, the reasonability of a self-help approach toward something which is much more inclusive, and that would be the matter of paradise. Okay. Let me move on, unless there's someone else.
That's it for now.
Okay. Di Marte. Let's go to Mars. Here in the shape of this huge cross in the sky are martyrs and crusaders and people who fought the good fight. And as with the other levels, the Mars imagery is all over the place. You see there are allusions to rubies and red lights, and there's also mention of strengthening and fortifying. And here Dante meets his ancestor Cacciagita, who died in the Second Crusade. And it is from Cacciagita that Dante hears about his upcoming exile from Florence. It's interesting that it takes up to Paradise to set the matter straight for the pilgrim in a way that actually makes sense and has some context. And also amongst Mars, you see various warriors, crusaders, sort of what you would expect, actually. It's not very surprising. What is surprising is when we get to Jupiter, or as we say in Massachusetts, Jupiter. Jupiter is not, if you recall, Sun is the shape of circle, concentric circles, Mars the shape of a cross, Jupiter the shape of an eagle. And when no one individual speaks, the entire eagle speaks. So here's Dante way up in the sky talking to an eagle about divine justice. By the way, there is a analogy. In Purgatory, we talked about the 7 planets and the 7 deadly or cardinal sins. In Paradise, there is the sun and the 3 planets above, and they correlate with what are called the 4 cardinal virtues. That the sun correlates with wisdom, Mars correlates with courage or fortitude, Jupiter correlates with justice. And most of the conversation upon Jupiter is about divine justice and why are some people saved and some not, why are, is someone from India who had no understanding of Christ not saved, and all that we can easily come up with ourselves. And it's interesting that now by justice is meant everything being in its right place and having the right proportionality. It's not so far from Plato's idea of justice in the Republic. However, divine justice is not reasonable from our limited earthly point of view. Although our earthly justice sort of is a model for us of what the real thing must be like. It's interesting in the sphere of Jupiter, we have much more stuff that feels like outer planets. We're actually going toward the transpersonal. In Saturn, the people are much more dour. They are much more strict. Beatrice doesn't smile because they're in Saturn. And this is the realm of the contemplatives. These are the great monastic leaders. And they come down descending in a ladder from the stars. And Saturn is here represented by the virtue of temperance. And by temperance is sort of the prelude to being able to deny oneself bodily pleasures and comforts, for there are much greater pleasures and comforts with the divine. Now, past Saturn, we go to the fixed stars. We go to Gemini. Dante is quizzed by apostles. He goes up to the first motion of Prima Mobile. He talks to, he sees spheres of angels where he thought there'd be planets. He finally goes up to the celestial rose, where at the end of the poem is a direct vision of God. What's interesting is, in order to get to the direct vision of God, Paradise has this sort of very organized step-by-step process that is modeled by the spheres of the planets. And here we're seeing the planets in a higher, is more evocative of our ultimate potential. Whereas in Purgatory, they were more the things that we have to grapple with in our sort of confused lives as hopeful but suffering humans, to emerge from the more elemental realities that we see depicted in hell. Okay, it is almost 7:30 here. Better not be 7:30 for you California folks. So it's almost time to close. Any questions? There's obviously a lot that can be said.
Well, while we wait, almost too much to be said. There's a thank you for a wonderful lecture. Looking forward to your new book. When is it coming out?
Well, first let me finish the manuscript. You'll know when I do. Probably in a couple weeks.
Okay.
If I apply myself in a very Saturnine and Mars kind of way, the good sides of both planets.
Oh, there is a question on
yes.
the rose. Is the rose kind of like God, or rose as God?
Okay. Well, the rose is, think of the petals on a rose. Think of this petal having many layers, all moving toward a center. That center would be God. The rose actually contains it's like the stadium of the saved. It's like a coliseum where you have various groupings of people, and Virgin Mary is the closest, and John the Baptist is real close, and others are furthest away, and there are kids at the bottom. And God is like that light that comes down from the center of the rose. Interestingly, all the people on the planets are there only for the education of the pilgrim. They all exist in various places in this sort of cosmic stadium.
Okay, there is there's a comment, and I mean, know that back then you only stopped at Saturn, but do you, in your comment of transpersonal, where does like the planet Uranus, where would you say it would fit into this?
My sense is that you get that on the sphere of Jupiter. See, when you get to Saturn, you're moving straight toward contemplation. With Jupiter, there's a sense of a transition. And Jupiter, the cantos of Jupiter, they're strong Uranian and Neptunian symbolism. Obviously, Dante didn't mean to, but the whole, I mean, the transpersonal stage, if it is valid, is universal, and he would have sort of intuited that. Yeah, it's a good question. It's very interesting to try to take what we understand as modern astrologers and kind of look at what he was doing in the early 1300s.
Do these views originate with Dante, or were they common ideas of the period?
These were actually, the setup of Paradise was pretty fixed. He did a lot of narrative around that, filled in a lot of details, much the same way as the Greek myths were fixed, but between Homer and Euripides, they would do things with them. Purgatorio was his own invention. He has complete claim on that. Inferno is loosely based on some material in Aristotle. There's it is much more his creation than Paradise. Yeah, a lot of these ideas were certainly around. The more I've read into Dante's time, the more I see that he's a very imaginative, creative, but also very synthetic poet. He takes from a lot of different sources, and he wields them in some interesting ways.
There is a comment on what was the name of your book? She missed the beginning, and please do an audio version.
An audio version of the book? Okay, actually, it's going to be a perfect e-reader book. But it's called Between Fortune and Providence, Astrology and the Universe in Dante's Divine Comedy.
Okay.
And since I live in Providence, I'm still looking for fortune. There's, there's some play I have with this.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph.
Thank
this was
you.
really fun.
This is a good time. We'll do it again sometime.
Here's a comment. Sheer profundity. Yes. Very beautiful stuff. Thanks. Appreciate your books, by the way.
Good day. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.